Good morning. Welcome to this metadata webinar. I'm Jason Cadules with the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program. Joining me is Mimi Zing with the Dauphin Island Sea Lab Data Management Center. The intent of this webinar is to allow you to explore the tools and information contained with metadata. The NEP has selected the Dauphin Island Sea Lab as our data management center, so any contractors and researchers that are working with us will be required to create metadata with their products moving forward. This webinar today will be broken into 4 sections. They are being recorded and will be uploaded to both the NEP's website as well as the Sea Lab's Data Management Center. So welcome, enjoy, and Mimi, thank you for participating.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, as Jason said, my name is Mimi. I'm with the DISL Data Management Center. This metadata training webinar is, as he said, broken into 4 parts, and we are going to start basically. Let me go ahead and advance to the next slide. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Yes, 4 parts. We're going to start with explaining what metadata is, sort of a metadata 101. We're going to go into detail about what the ISO 19115-2 metadata standard, which is the one that is in use at this moment by all the federal agencies of the U.S., and so DISL Data Management is following suit. A metadata standard is basically a formalized way of putting your metadata into a certain order, so all of the information that you stick into it is going to end up being easy to find when you compare metadata for different data sets, multiple data sets. And after we go into detail about the metadata standard that we're going to be using, I'm going to go into detail about some of the resources that we have at DISL Data Management to make it a little bit easier to write metadata. And then finally, I will be ending the webinar with an introduction to software documentation, which is basically it's metadata for software. And by software we mean processing scripts, the kinds of things that you write to process your data from the point when you first collect it to when you make the final version of it for like presentations and reports and things. Okay, and so without further ado, what is metadata? On a very basic level, metadata is like a label on canned food. If you look at a can of food, and it doesn't have a label on it, this is like a data set, but you don't know what's in it, you don't know anything about it. So think of metadata as similar to a label on a can. I mean, a lot of people, when they hear the word metadata, they get, it's kind of a big word, and it's kind of scary sometimes, but really all it means is that it describes your data set. It's a description. When you're looking at canned food, or here's the metadata for a can of food. Metadata tends to be grouped into different categories. For example, as you see in the middle part, you can see, for example, here's the name of the food. It's chicken noodle soup. You can see the manufacturer of the food, which is samples. You can see some additional basic information like how much does it weigh, how many ounces. That it's condensed. And then on the left and the right, you have additional information that's more detailed and it's more specific to the types of people that are looking for, depending on what you as a user might want to do with your data set or a can of food. So for example, if you want to know nutritional information, you see that. If you want to know what the ingredients are, it's over here. If you're trying to cook the food, here's the instructions for how to do that. So, okay, here's some more examples just to give you some more idea of how this works. On the right, you see a photograph, or it could be a postcard. If you're old enough to remember when photographs were taken on film, some people, you might think about it like a photo album. You have lots of print versions of photographs in an album, and on the backs of these things, you might have written down some basic information about what the photograph is. So in this particular example, it's an aurora with a comet. Other things about metadata, though, you're not looking, this is metadata, but it's not very complete. It doesn't tell you a lot of things about the photograph that you might also want to know. For example, which comet was it? What was the date of the photograph? where was this taken, who took the picture, what kind of camera was used to take the picture, did they, and details about the photography, like what was the f-stop and the film speed and things like that. So, when you have really basic metadata, it'll give you sort of broad overview, but you usually want more information than that for a data set. Here's another example, also for people who are old enough to remember. Before computers came along, if you went to a library and you were looking for a book, you would have to look through something called a card catalog. And basically, a card catalog is sort of like the metadata for the entire library. Each card is a metadata for a particular book. So it'll tell you, for example, the name of the title of the book, the authors, where was it published, the physical dimensions of the book, like is it a big book, little book. And usually it also includes information using the Dewey Decimal System for where the book is located in the library, so that if you are looking through the card catalog and you want to actually look at the book, you'll know where to go in the library to find it. Okay, here's another example. This one kind of takes us closer to home. This is an actual data set. It's a sort of a geospatial data set. On the right, you have a map of the Gulf of Mexico with color gradients. On the left, it tells you what it's a picture of. It tells you that the color gradient is temperature. If you didn't have that metadata, there are a lot of other things that you can make color gradients of. For example, chlorophyll or light penetration or color dissolved organic matter, salinity, things like that. But you have a metadata record to tell you exactly what it is. And if you look a little bit, we're going to look at the left part of it in more detail later on, especially in sections 2 and 3 of this webinar. This is actually formatted in the ISO 19115-2 standard that we'll be going over. It has a title at the top, and underneath that you see some blue links, and those are different categories that breaks down the information about the data set in more detail, depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so when you're looking at what kind of information about data you would want to include in the metadata. Metadata standards will break all of this down for you, and they will usually, if you look at it in the form of who, what, when, where, why, how, as different categories, that usually encapsulates all of the types of information that you're going to need to include. Who would be like not only who collected the data and processed the data, but also who has the data now. Did you put it into a repository? Can you contact them? And also the funding agencies tend to be important because funding agencies like to be credited for the data sets that they funded. What would be, that would be your title, your abstract, your purpose, what actually is the data set and why was it collected. When and where, it's like the time frame that you started your field collections on this date and went to this date. Where would be, what was your study area, where were your station locations. For when, it doesn't have to be, if you're looking at a historical data set and you don't actually know when the data was collected or processed, you can also put down unknown in most metadata standards, including ISO. And likewise, if it's a data collection that's continuing to be collected, like a time series, you could say, instead of having an end date, you could say now, the time, we started in 2004 and we're still going. Why and how, why would be, why would the purpose of the data collection would be basically what was the study that you collected the data for, which is actually different than what, as in what is the actual data. I mean, what things did you measure and where did you measure it? How would be, for example, how are they, that would be your methodology section, basically, if you were in a report or a paper. You want to go into enough detail describing the how that someone else could pick up the data set and know exactly how it got to the state that it's in. You had your raw collections in the field. What did you do to it on the way to get it to the final form that you see in the report? And also, how do you access the data? Like, for example, if it's in a repository somewhere, where can you go to download it? Is there a fee? If it's a commercialized data set, sometimes they charge fees. There might be shipping and handling fees if you want it in some form other than just a download, like if you want to order it on CDs or something. Okay. Another way of looking at categories of data of data, of information in a data set. You have generalized data, which is, as we described before, your name, your title, your publication date, who created it, and all of that. License is one thing that we didn't mention previously, and that means how you're allowing the data set to be used. In most academic settings, most people just want to, attribution. You just have to credit the people who created the data set. So if you're using a Creative Commons license, to make it more formalized, it would be CC or CC BY. In most cases, you're not going to see a lot of licenses on data sets yet. It's important to have, but a lot of, especially in academic circles, I don't think most people really think about it that way, because if you're sharing your data set in the first place, it's kind of taken for granted that you want to have everyone use it and do whatever they like with it. But if you want to be more restrictive about that, for example, if you want to specify you may only use this data set for specific uses, you may not sell it, you may not do presentations with it without consent of the data set creator, because for example, well, there's one example I can think of right offhand, is that we had one researcher who had a data set used prematurely in a presentation, and it created some issues with the funding agencies and the other parties who had created the data set, that said, we didn't realize that this presentation was ready to go yet. And this is, why is this data set being used by these people instead of those people? So licenses can be important. They can also be called data sharing plans, which is where you say, you have assigned this agreement for how you use the data. Domain specific would be, what field of scientific study is it in? Categories would be, like, is it oceanography? Is it estuarine biology? Is it ecology? Keywords is, if you've ever written a scientific paper, you'll see keywords that just kind of gives you broad tags of what sort of topics are your data set. It helps people be able to find your data set if they're looking for it. They're going to be, if they want salinity data, for example, you might put in salinity so people know that it's there, so they can find it with a keyword search. Related links would be, is your data set related to any other data sets? Is it part of a larger study that collected lots of data sets? Are there other data sets that are extremely similar to yours that are part of other studies? Those kinds of links might be important to include in your metadata, just so that people who are looking for your data set, they might be interested in what other data sets there are that, as a sort of a broader context. And data set characteristics, finally, last but not least, is where you describe what your data set actually looks like. And let's go to the next slide. So in a lot of cases, data sets tend to be, there's usually some sort of tabular data somewhere. You have a table with column headings. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be, if you're using ArcGIS, it could be an attribute table. And when you're writing your metadata, you want to be able to explain what each of these column headings mean. What are they for? If you have abbreviations, you want to spell them out. If you have units, if you have numbers, you want to have units for every number. If the units are abbreviated, you want to spell those out also. But if you're looking at time and place, time zone, that just means that in a lot of cases, for example, you'll be just doing local time. But if you did you want to, it might be important to note, did you take into account daylight savings? Did you move your clock forward and back for when you recorded the time that you collected your data? Or did you just go with Central Standard Time at all times, even if it was Central Daylight Time? If you adjusted this hour back from whatever your wristwatch says. Or did you use GMT or UTC and just have all of your times be, universally the same? That's important to note for people, especially if you have time series data of high resolution temporally. You want to be able to spell out exactly what time zone you used. For place, there's basically latitude and longitude. It tends to be the most common thing. If it's a water column data, you want the depth to be included. If it, sediment samples, same thing. Sediment depth, did you take it at the surface? Did you take it further down? Scientific names for species. If you're recording the names of the biota that you're collecting, like plants or fish or crabs and shrimp or whatever. You might just give all of the common names like, red snapper, vermilion snapper. But in your metadata, you want to note what the actual Latin names of those are. So red snapper would be Lagianus campechanus. Vermilion would be Brumboplites arborubens. For different plants, like if you're studying marsh plants, you want Spartina alterniflora or Juncus vulmerianus or whatever it is. You want to be sure to note that somewhere, even if it's not. When you're actually doing a study, it can be. It's not always going to be immediately important to keep track of that information because you know what you're talking about when you're doing your study and your data set is a working data set. But when it comes time to make it presentable to other people to be able to use, they're going to need to know all of that basic information. And actually getting your data set organized well enough to be able to present all of that kind of information can take some time because in a lot of cases, as a practicing scientist, you might not have all of that information organized for yourself in a single place. So it can take a little bit of hunting around in your files and your emails and whatever to get all of that information together. And that's actually one of the more time-consuming parts of getting a metadata record together. It's not so much writing the metadata record itself, it's collecting all of the information that needs to go into it. Explanations and methodologies, that would be your lab sampling protocol, your field sampling protocols. If you're using a methodology that is published, or like the EPA has protocols for doing certain things, and they have that published online somewhere, you could point to a PDF. Just be sure you find out where the links are to that. Where's the website that you can find this methodology so someone else can look it up. A note about citations. A lot of times when people are writing metadata, they're getting to the methodology part of it, and they already have a report about the study that they're also writing. It saves time to copy paste the methodology out of the report and stick it in the methodology in the data quality section for a metadata record. When you do that, though, you have to make sure that anything that you talk about in the report is also in the data set. So, and anything that, because anything that is included in your data set needs to have some sort of methodology about it. Sometimes reports will cover additional types of data that's not in the data set, and so you want to make sure you read through it and delete the parts that aren't relevant, especially if you reference like figures or tables in your report. That's not going to be in the metadata, so you want to be sure to delete those. A few notes about data accessibility. This is after you finish compiling your metadata and you're trying to make it available online or in any other way for other people to use. First you have to have your metadata. You have to have a data set license, and we talked about that a bit ago. Accessibility. Now the whole point of writing metadata to a standard is to make it accessible by both you as a human user typing keywords into a website, and a machine, which does better if you have all of the individual pieces of information organized in the same way and have the same tags. And that's kind of the additional point of having a metadata standard, such as ISO 9115. Persistent identifier, the broad term for that is PID, but normally people think of DOI, which means digital object identifier. It's a unique series of letters and numbers and characters that indicate your specific data set. It could be data sets, it could be publications, actually reports, journal articles, and things like that as well. But data sets having a DOI makes it a lot easier for people to reference it later. Speaking of reference, there's citation preference down in the lower right corner of this graphic. And that just basically means who do you want listed as the authors of your data set, what is the title of your data set, what year was the data set published. You might include information like, where is it located, what is the repository link, and also, last accessed can be important. For example, if it's a data set that's part of a larger data set, or if you're making updates to it because you've done some data quality checks and you've corrected some errors, and you've put up an updated version of the data set. Someone who is citing it in something in a paper, if they have a last access, then you have some idea of what version of the data set they were looking at for their citation. And I think I skipped over a publication in a shared repository, which just means, let's see, some national repositories where we put data sets. The Dauphin Island Sea Lab defaults to the NOAA NCI, which is the National Centers for Environmental Information. They basically are sort of this giant clearinghouse of all data sets related to anything that NOAA is interested in, which is oceanographic and climate. And so they have a pretty good size data repository for that. Most of ours at the Sea Lab goes to their National Ocean Archive, but they have 3 or 4 other ones for different topics. I think climate has a separate one. Other repositories, NASA has several of them. They do a lot of space. They also do a lot of climate. They do Earth-related studies, global scale, because they have satellites that collect satellite imagery from orbit, and all of that is searchable from NASA. There's one called BCODEMO, which is the Biological and Chemical Oceanography. I forget what DMO stands for, but that's hosted at Woods Hole, and it's also oceanography data, so that's another big one. There are other ones, lots of repositories. In the case of Mobile Bay NEP, Mobile Bay NEP, since it's a part of DISL, all of the data sets that are generated by you for NEP will eventually end up at DISL, and then DISL will probably submit it to NCEI, so that after all is said and done, if you need to look for your data sets again, it'll probably be over at NCEI. And that's it for the first section. Thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. I think we're going to take a short break, so I'm going to stop recording, and if you have any questions, now is a good time to ask.